Good afternoon, everyone. It's a joy to see you on this August day of 1777. Mrs. Washington at your service. And I am understanding that there are a few people who might have some questions for me, which I am more than happy to answer. It has been some time since I've been down to the capital city, what with my travels to the encampments taking up the majority of the last year or so. But I have come down to the city on, in fact, some family matters. My nephews, the Bassett boys, are due to have their smallpox inoculations. And since I had my smallpox inoculation last year in 76, I thought to take them back to Mount Vernon with me, where they could undergo the inoculation and the quarantine, surrounded by those who love them very much. But, of course, while I was here, the mayor and the city council of Williamsburg have decided to waylay my journey for a day or two because they have intentions of presenting me with a gold medal and the freedom of the city, which I think I am not, I should not have that honor for. Now, I understand that they are in fact for my husband, not for me, but I shall take them in his place. And so while I am waiting upon the mayor to call upon me, I thought to make myself available to you. Should you have any questions? It's, as I said, been some time since I've come down to Williamsburg, so I wanted to make myself available to you. It's been an interesting turn of events over the past few years. You know, I was born not 25 miles from this place out in New Kent County. And I have to tell you, Williamsburg has always been like a second home to me. My father, being a clerk of the county, came into Williamsburg on government business quite frequently. And I, being the eldest of all of my siblings, well, I, of course, would join him with as much frequency as possible. And growing up, everyone has known me here. However, I've noticed over the past year or so that instead of calling me Mrs. Washington, they now call me Lady Washington, which is a title that I have had bestowed upon me over the past few years in traveling with my husband to the winter encampments. But I am hoping, my friends, that while we are together, that you might call me just Mrs. Washington, for you are old and dear friends to me. But here I should cease speaking, and I should like to know what you should wish to speak on. I have my man, Mr. Smith, just on the other side of the room from me, and he has told me that there are several questions that perhaps you should like for me to answer. So I shall ask. Mr. Smith, is there a question for me?
They are rolling in, Mrs. Washington. Are you ready?
I am, sir.
The first question is about you and your time in Virginia and around this entire country. It's about the differences between living in Williamsburg versus living at your home at Mount Vernon.
I see. The question is the differences in living in and around Williamsburg as compared to Mount Vernon. Well, I will be perfectly honest with you. I do not know if I could ever truly qualify myself as having lived in Williamsburg. I was born near here along the Pamunkey River at my family estate called Chestnut Grove. And as I've said, it's only some 25 miles away from the capital city. Although I do, I retain the life rights to several pieces of property here in Williamsburg. Anything with Custis on the name, I have life rights to, as Mr. Custis was my first husband. And upon his death, I received my widow's share, which was 1/3 of his real property, to have use of during my life, including the great Custis Square house that's on the back street here. And I will say, though, that the Colonel and I did spend the first 3 months of our marriage here in Williamsburg. Well, he was a colonel then, I should say. But other than that, I cannot truly qualify myself as living in Williamsburg. In fact, right now, I'm staying at the townhome of my sister's mother-in-law, Mrs. Dawson, who is always so kind to open her doors. But comparing Williamsburg to Mount Vernon, well, they are as different as night and day. The first time I ever saw Mount Vernon, it was only about 3 months after my marriage to Colonel Washington, as he was then. I had never seen Mount Vernon, only had it described to me by Colonel Washington. We left in April from Williamsburg, and when we arrived on April 6th of 59, I saw for the first time what was going to be my home. At the time, it was a house. At the time, it was a bachelor's house. But not long after we moved in with my two children, it truly did become a home. And Mount Vernon is, well, it is so pleasantly situated right there on the banks of the Potomac. And enjoying that wonderful view every morning is something that I think is a blessing from God. But I will say that one of the best parts of living in the country are absolutely the vegetables. They cannot be compared to our vegetables that we have in the gardens up at Mount Vernon compared to what we can grow here in Williamsburg. I hope that answered your question. Mr. Smith?
Well, you've already been speaking of home and your domestic life, so there's a question and about your husband. What are your favorite qualities of the general?
My favorite qualities of the general. I have to remember that I'm speaking to the public, don't I? You know, my husband is an interesting fellow. He is one whom, and I'm sure that if you have had the pleasure of spending any time with him, there are in fact two General Washingtons. There is the general, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Forces, and then there is my husband. I am blessed to know the man behind the uniform, and he is one in our many years of marriage at this point that I've always found to be very kind, warm. And from the infancy of our relationship, we have always acted as partners to one another. And that is something that I cherish in our very successful and up to this point, long marriage. We are happiest when we are together. And thankfully, he and I both understand that about each other, and we try and be around one another as often as we can, which has had me traveling to the winter encampments of the Army for the past several years, something that I never in a million years thought, growing up along the banks of the Pamunkey River, that I would be involved with. But there you are. Life is always giving you new and exciting challenges to undertake. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Smith? What
are your duties at winter encampments?
My duties at the encampments? Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you, Mr. Smith, it is not to pick up a musket with a bayonet on it and drill with the soldiers. No, my responsibilities, my husband is the commander-in-chief of the Army. However, during the encampments, the fighting dies down, but the politicking does not. And while my husband may be a master over the battlefield, the dining table, that is my battlefield. Thus, when I come to the winter encampments, be it in Cambridge or Morristown or wherever the Army might find itself, I find that my duty is twofold. One, to provide comfort to my husband, but two, to manage his dining table. For there are countless foreign dignitaries, congressmen, their wives, local dignitaries who grace the winter encampments to see the state of the Continental Army and to see if it is something worth supporting and investing in. And when I host a dinner for them, it is my hope that they see the best of what the Army can offer. And so I manage my husband's household, which is my duty at home, and it is my duty wherever he is. For I have discovered that our house could be anywhere, but home is where the two of us are together. Mr. Smith?
Katie asks about quarantine and illness. Have you ever been quarantined?
Katie, you're asking about quarantining, and I am assuming you are speaking about the smallpox inoculation. Yes, I have been quarantined before. Last summer, in the summer of '76, I took it upon myself to become inoculated from the smallpox right there in Philadelphia. My husband was not sure that I was going to go through with it. I had just been with him in Cambridge and in and around Boston when the city was evacuated, and I saw the devastation that the smallpox rendered to that once very proud city. And I took it upon myself to realize that if I was truly going to be helpful to not only the Army, but to my husband, that I needed to take all precautions that I could. And so on the way home, I stopped in Philadelphia in May of '76, and I received the smallpox inoculation. John Hancock offered me his home to recuperate in and undergo the quarantine, but I did not wish to put any more burden on Mrs. Hancock. So I took the inoculation and the quarantine in Mr. Randolph's lodging house. Now, the inoculation, Katie, if you have not heard of it, it is truly nothing to be frightened of. In fact, we have known of the smallpox inoculation for many, many years, coming not only to England, but to America in 17 and 21. And all it requires of you is to have a small cut somewhere on the scarf of your skin, be it on your arm or be it on your thigh, no thicker than the width of a piece of paper. And on the lancet that makes that cut, of course, there's a bit of matter from someone who has had a mild case of the smallpox. Once it is in your blood, it is then bound, and the hope is that you contract a mild form of the smallpox, undergo a quarantine so that you do not spread it to anyone else. And by the time you have had the scabs fall off from you, then you are rendered immune from the disease. I took the inoculation very well, having only a very few pustules upon me and none on my face, thank heavens. But it has rendered me immune, and it has rendered my ability to have service to my husband that much more valuable. So much so that my husband saw the wonderful effects of the inoculation and has encouraged Congress to have the entire army inoculated. And those inoculations began earlier this year in January of 77. So it is our hope that the American army will not be devastated by that speckled monster. Mr. Smith?
That sounds terrifying.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Smith.
I'm glad you survived.
Thank you, I am too.
Can we change to a lighthearted topic?
I would love it to change the subject.
How about pets? We have several questions about pets.
Pets!
What animals do you have at your plantations? Do you have any pets? What are their names? What are your favorite pets?
Well, pets. We do have a vast number of animals on the estate, some of whom I think I could qualify as pets, some of whom I think would be more qualifying as working animals. For instance, my husband, the general, has 35 foxhounds that he keeps in a kennel right off of the main mansion house there. He visits them every morning and every evening when he is at home. But I do not truly consider them pets, even though some of them have very sweet names, like Sweet Lips and True Love. But truthfully, I think what I would consider a pet is I do have, I have always found birds to be very fascinating. In fact, one time my husband purchased a bird from a man who had sailed his ship up from the West Indies. We keep them on the back porch, as it were, but we keep those in cages. And I think I would qualify those more as pets than my husband's foxhounds. And then, of course, we have a wide assortment of horses and other animals that are used for our farming as well.
Any of them have names? I mean, like Mr. Jefferson? Have you named any Mr. Jefferson or Hamilton?
I don't think that I would name any of my animals after Mr. Jefferson or Mr. Hamilton, Mr. Smith. Although, would you like me to?
Yes. Your prized cow.
My prized cow! I shall take it into consideration.
We have a lot of questions about food.
Yes?
About how you set your table, what food do you like to bake, or what food do you like to cook, or what food do you serve others when they're sitting at your table?
One of my favorite subjects is, of course, food, and of course, dining, for that is an art form that I have been trained by my mother since I was a very young girl. My mother trained myself and my sisters to be Roman matrons over our households. And it is from the dining table that indeed we, the ladies of the household, can effect the most change sometimes. We are very regimented in our schedule at Mount Vernon. My husband rises very early, as do I. He tends to rise a bit before I do, but breakfast every morning is at 7 o'clock sharp. And it is usually a light fare, perhaps of cold meats from the night before, tea, coffee, chocolate. My husband prefers hoe cakes drenched in honey and at least 2 bowls of tea. We take our dinner, our afternoon meal, strictly at 3 o'clock. My husband allows about 5 minutes variance for pocket watches, but then the meal begins. And that, I believe, is, would you consider our more lavish meal of the day. My dining table always has a boiled ham at the head of it, and right down the middle are 4 or 5 different meats. There are vegetables to go all the way around the outside, and we, of course, employ the French style of service, which means that everyone serves whatever is in front of their plate. So the first 10 minutes or so of the meal, you have plates whizzing all around the table with people shouting over one another, saying exactly what they wish. But once the plates are served, then that is the first course of the meal. Then, of course, that is cleared away, and the next course we might have tarts and pies, and then, of course, those are cleared away, and we might have a fruit or a dessert or perhaps nuts. So that meal can take several hours. We, of course, then oftentimes have tea again at 7 o'clock in the evening, and depending upon what our company might wish, we would also have another lighter meal later on in the evening. I should say my day is quite occupied with what is going on out of my kitchen. One of the first people that I meet with every single morning is my cook, and she is also one of the last people that I see every morning. We have quite a routine with one another, as it were. I hope that answers your question. Mr. Smith?
We have so many questions that are almost exactly the same. I hesitate to dig into your personal life much further, but everyone wants to know how you met George.
Which George?
Well, I suppose your husband, George Washington.
I'm shocked, Mr. Smith, that you would be so informal as to call him George. I don't even call him that in public.
I'm just reading what the people write.
I see. I am not shocked, my friends, that you wish to know how I met my husband. But, it happened many years ago, as you can understand. Now, first of all, you must understand, General Washington is not my first husband. I was married when I was 18 years old to my next door neighbor, in fact, out in New Kent County, a man who, he moved to the area when I was 4 years old, and he was 24 years old. Daniel Park Custis. He was of the great Custis family that has some holdings out on the Eastern Shore, but even more here in Williamsburg. And I remember as a child seeing Mr. Custis and always wondering why he looked so, sad. And my mother always told me when I was very young that I was being impertinent to ask about the private lives of others. But when I was about 15 or so, and I began coming to more social events in the capital city, I truly began to understand Mr. Custis. You see, he was the son of John Custis IV, who was the owner of Custis Square just here on the back street in Williamsburg. And Mr. Custis was a difficult man, some might say. When his son, Daniel, was finally able to escape his tyrannical grasp, he was 24, and he chose an estate not so far away from Williamsburg, 25 miles as the crow flies, out in New Kent, called the White House, which just so happens to be 4 miles upriver from my childhood home of Chestnut Grove. Well, by the time I was 17, Mr. Custis and I, our neighborly friendship turned into a deep affection, and we decided that we should very much like to be married. Mr. Custis was not altogether thrilled with the notion of his son and heir of the Custis estate marrying the daughter of a clerk, but after some prudent conversations, Mr. Custis was convinced. In fact, I think he even told one of our friends that he should wish Daniel to have me over any lady in Virginia, and indeed he was just as enamored with me as Daniel was, all owing to a prudent speech that I made to him. My mother has always taught me the power of words. Well, regardless, we married in May when I was 18, and we, friends, had 7 very happy years of marriage and 4 beautiful children that the Lord blessed us with. My son survives, but then my Daniel was taken from me. It was the summer of 57. There had been an illness in the Monkey area. It affected many of the children along the area, and indeed our son, John, was affected by it. It was an infection of the throat. We called Dr. Carter out from Williamsburg, in fact, several times to attend to Jackie during that time. And just as Jack was recovering from it, Daniel was stricken with it, and he was gone within 4 days. Which left me a widow, with at that time 2 small children and an entire estate to manage, for Daniel passed away without writing a will. And I was named the administratrix of the entirety of the Custis estate, which included at that time over 17,700 acres of property spread over 6 counties, 300 slaves, bank stocks in London, thousands of pounds of tobacco in transit to our factors, and my 2 children, who, by law, were orphans, as their father had died, all left to me. And I decided to take my new duties and responsibilities very seriously. My children's legacy was left to me to manage, and I did have the assistance of several very kind gentlemen during that time. Mr. Robinson, the former speaker, became the guardian to my children. Mr. Nicholas, the now former treasurer, became a trusted advisor. And my brother Bartholomew, of course, gave me advices as well. But I decided to keep to myself during that time, not coming into Williamsburg as frequently as perhaps I had once. And after about, almost a year of being widowed, my neighbors out in New Kent, the Chamberlains, decided that they would like to play Cupid. They invited me to their estate, and Mrs. Chamberlain would not let me leave until her husband Richard had come home from Williamsburg. When Mr. Chamberlain finally arrived from Williamsburg, he had brought a very distinguished guest with him. A very tall, red-headed, blushing up to his eyebrows, Colonel Washington, who had been in Williamsburg attending again to some private business. Mr. and Mrs. Chamberlain saw fit to reintroduce us and left us to our own devices. And now you must understand, friends, I knew of Colonel Washington. We all knew of Colonel Washington by that time. He had come to some fame in the late war with the French and the Indians. I think his journals had even been published at that time. And so it was a happy reintroduction of an old friend. But one thing that truly impressed me upon our first meeting was the fact that Colonel Washington, he asked me what I wanted to do, which was unlike many of the other gentlemen, because, friends, there were so many gentlemen who were so eager to help me during that time, so many gentlemen who were renewing friendships that I did not know existed. And every one of them had a piece of advice to give me, what I should do with my property, what I should do with my children, with my people. Not a single one of them asked me what I wanted to do. Until Colonel Washington. He intrigued me. And after we spoke for an entirely too long of time, I asked him that when next he were in the area, that perhaps he would stop by my estate of the White House. And he was back in 2 weeks. We are both very determined people. That started several meetings betwixt us in that early spring of 58. And in not a short amount of time later, we decided that we should very much like to be partners with one another. And I agreed to marry him. And then he went away for 9 months. He was still engaged with the army, and he had promised to go on Forbes' expedition. But at the end of it, he came back to Williamsburg, resigned his commission, and arrived at my estate, the White House, on Christmas Eve of 58. And we were married 2 weeks later, on January 6th of 59. And I will be honest with you, friends, I did not marry a soldier. I married a farmer. So our life together already has had many twists and turns, but I cannot think of sharing it with anyone better than General Washington. I hope that answered your question. Mr. Smith?
Do you enjoy being married?
Do I enjoy being married? Well, I should certainly hope so. Yes, I do enjoy being married very much. The General and I, as I've said, we tend to work as partners with one another, always asking one another's advices on anything that might affect the household or the Washington family. And I think that I have found my equal in many ways. So I am very blessed to have a partner such as General Washington.
Your eyes light up when you talk about him.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
There are several comments about your clothing.
Oh, my clothing.
Grace says your gown is gorgeous.
Thank you, Grace.
Caitlin wants to know about not just these clothes, but your other clothing. How many shoes do you have?
How many shoes? Well, I must admit to you, Caitlin, I am a little bit of a clothes horse. I do enjoy clothes. I do enjoy shoes. But I will also be honest with you, Caitlin. Clothing is a very powerful thing for us ladies because it is an outward appearance of exactly what we wish society to know about us. For instance, when I was Mrs. Custis, I dressed appropriately in silks and hoops and had my hair piled on top of my head and powdered every time that I was out in public. But I have discovered over the last several years that fashion is a very powerful tool. I will give you an example. When I was traveling to the first winter encampment back in 75, my husband called for me to join him at Cambridge. And I will be honest, I hesitated for a time, but eventually when I decided to take the journey, I realized that people were watching me. They were watching what I did, what I said, what I didn't do, and they were watching what I wore. And I realized that as my husband represented each and every soul under his command, that my duty as his lady was to represent those at home, to give those left at home some type of guidance as to how to embrace this new idea of being Republican. And so I ceased wearing any type of English import during that time, adopting only homespun. So I ceased powdering my hair, as you can see, ceased having our people wear their livery, because we wished to be a representation of what we wished the country to show, frugality and industry. And so the Washington family understand the importance of fashion, and we try and use it to our best advantage when we can.
Is that a role that you take on as a woman at large in the 18th century?
It is a role that I take on as a lady at large, for there is a distinction betwixt a lady and a woman. I am understanding that while I might not have a voice in the House of Burgesses, I have a voice in every time I walk down the street in representing not only myself, but my family and where we stand politically as well.
Bethany wants to know if you foresee the roles of women changing because of this revolution.
Oh, Bethany, you have asked quite an interesting question. Do I foresee the roles of women changing because of this revolution? I have already seen the role of women change. I have seen women taking up where their husbands have left them, managing businesses, trades, shops, estates. I have seen women asked to play their part in this fight already, melting clock weights into bullets, donating monies and clothing to our soldiery. We women have always had an active role to play, but I have seen now, more than perhaps I have seen any time previously, women taking a step outside of the shadows of the domestic realm and truly taking on more responsibilities. I cannot see how this will not change women's roles, and for the better, I think. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Smith?
Absolutely. We have several questions about military and your involvement with military. And one question that stuck out is what kind of encouragement might you have for people with military families?
I understand. The question is, what encouragement would I give to those of military families? What I would tell you is that I am one of you. I am a soldier's wife. I did not marry a soldier, as I've said, but I find myself now married to one, and I understand the sacrifice that not only your husband, your brother, and your son might be making by fighting alongside General Washington, but also the sacrifice that you are making at home. It is a great burden left to those of us at home, and it is one that I acknowledge and respect, because I too am feeling that burden. But know that you are seen, know that you are loved, and you are one of many. And we have a responsibility to care for our neighbors during this great time of need and crisis.
There's a question about dancing, and Leanne seems to suggest that she knows that George Washington loves to dance
Ah.
and wonders if you equally love to dance.
I don't believe that it is any great secret that my husband is a very fine dancer. He, when he was very young, in fact, paid to have his own dancing lessons. But yes, my husband is a very fine dancer, and he outshines me on the dance floor. I profess that I have some proficiency in dancing, but I understand that my place at a ball is to watch my husband dance with any lady that he might wish to. And I am very happy to allow him to do that because I prefer to watch him dance. I think he finds a great deal of happiness and release, perhaps, whenever we have balls and assemblies and he is able to step on the dance floor. So I'm more than happy to allow him that comfort.
Can we talk about your upbringing, your
Of course.
childhood? What education did you have? What was your family life like as a child?
My education and family life as a child. Well, as we have touched on briefly, I was born some 25 miles from, well, where I am seated just now, out in New Kent County, right along the banks of the Pamunkey River, at my father's estate of Chestnut Grove. Now, my father comes from England. He arrived with my Uncle William early on, and he established himself right there in New Kent County. And he purchased an estate called Chestnut Grove, met my mother, Frances Jones, who has roots here in Williamsburg as well. In fact, my great-grandfather, Roland Jones, were the first rector of Bruton Parish Church. But they met and they married, and 1 year later, out I came. And I am the first of all of my siblings. I am the eldest of all 8 Dandridge siblings. And we had, in my opinion, quite an idyllic childhood right along the banks of the Pamunkey River. As the eldest, of course, I had special responsibilities because it was my responsibility to be a good example to my siblings, which I don't know if I always was, but I tried to be. And I have grown very fond and very close to several of my siblings. My brother Bartholomew and my sister Anna Maria in particular. The 3 of us are very close with one another and we keep in constant correspondence. But you asked about education. I was educated very typically for a young lady of the time, mostly at the hands of my mother. It is almost an expectation that women pass down the oral tradition of educating their daughters in how to manage a household, which has an extraordinarily large number of different facets to it. Everything that happens under my roof, I am aware of. I am capable of doing, or I'm more than capable of instructing someone else to do. And so I must not only care for all of those under my roof, but all of those people who are around my house. I must always be prepared for whomever might come to call. Then they might stay for 2 days or 20. And my mother prepared me and my sisters to manage a household with great efficiency. And that is an education that I was very much hoping to pass down to my daughter, but I'm very happy to have the honor of passing it to my nieces now.
We just have a few more time for questions, so if there are any other questions that people want to write in, I think now is the time to do it.
Certainly.
One question that stuck out to me is about horse riding and riding.
Horse riding.
Saddle specifically.
Riding aside, yes.
Riding aside, is it difficult to do? Is this something you learned early on?
I did learn early on. The question is in regards to riding and appropriate riding for ladies, of course. Yes, ladies do, as I'm sure you all know. We have different saddles than the gentlemen. We have women's saddles or ladies' saddles. And rather than being astride, we ride aside. And yes, it is something that I learned to do as a child. In fact, one time my father purchased me a pony and I took it across the Pamunkey to my uncle's home of Elsing Green, showing off to my cousins, of course, as was expected when you have a new pony. And I noticed that my mother and my aunt were not paying attention to me on the front porch. And so I told them that I would ride my pony on into the house unless they stopped me. They stopped me with one look And in that one look, I recognized that if I were wise, I would turn my pony around, return him back to the stables, and return and sit very quietly beside my mother for the rest of the day. And that is exactly what I did do. But yes, I have very much enjoyed riding for almost as long as I could remember. I cannot say that I have ridden as much in the past few years, but when I was younger, I truly enjoyed it. Yes, Mr. Smith. You seem very pleased with yourself.
Well, I'm very busy over here. I'm doing 3 things at once, and unfortunately, one of them is not listening to you. There's a lovely question about becoming a patriot versus growing up a loyalist. Can you walk us through that journey for you? What was it like? And is there a moment when was it a switch? Did you know the moment that you became a patriot, or was it?
Oh my goodness, what a fascinating question. The question is growing up a loyalist and realizing when I was a patriot. But you know, before I even begin to answer it, we must even think about the words used. Loyalist and patriot. They are one and the same, are they not? I truly guess it depends upon which side you choose to consider yourself of. Yes, I think that all of us could agree that we were born and raised as English citizens, and it has been all I have ever known. But you ask about the moment that I realized that I was going to support this great cause of American independency. And I think that it was not one lightning moment when I realized it, but a series of small, almost imperceptible movements toward that decision. But there was one moment when I realized that our family was past the point of no return, if you will. My husband attended the Congress several times, and when he went last in 1975, he took with him a military uniform, not putting himself forward for any type of position, but more acknowledging that Virginia was ready to stand with military might if necessary. At that Congress, they appointed my husband as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Forces. He wrote to me from Philadelphia, telling me of the Congress's decision and his great anxiety that accepting that command has brought upon him because he knew the uneasiness that it would present to me. It is something that we had spoken of many times before as almost an inevitability. But when I saw those words written on that piece of paper, and understanding that my husband wrote in that same letter that he had enclosed a will, it was like a splash of cold water in my face. My husband was prepared to die for this cause, and he still is. And that, I think, was the moment when I realized that my husband's duty is to this country, the United States of America, and my duty is to him. And I will support whatever cause that he might find himself in to our last hour. I hope that answers your question.
That's beautiful.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
You should write that down.
I'll leave that to Mr. Jefferson.
I suppose we are at the end. Is there anything that you want to say to the citizens of this fledgling republic?
Well, friends, it has been an honor spending this time with you. Admittedly, I have missed you all greatly, for as I've said at the beginning, it has been some time since I've been down to the city. But speaking with you and reliving old times and speaking about the current situation has warmed my heart in a way that I don't think that I truly understood that I needed. And so I thank you for that. It is always an honor coming down to the capital city and engaging with friends, new and old alike. And I am hoping, friends, that the next time that we can engage in polite conversation as we have, my husband will be able to join us. We will be at peace, and he will be a private citizen once again. Until that time, my friends, it is always a joy.